Our text for today's sermon is from Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 5. The word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that the Lord may teach us the Lord's ways, and that we may walk in the Lord's paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The Lord shall judge the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. When I first began mulling over this passage of Isaiah, it was late October, which was peak leaf season here in D.C. I walked the neighborhoods around the seminary, enjoying the leaves in their full autumnal glory. But with every tree blazing into new color, I felt a bit of sadness, knowing what was in store for those trees. Soon they would lose their brilliance. Ancient prophets, like Isaiah, must have felt similarly as they spoke to the situation of their day, a society with behaviors leading away from God and to death. If we look at the passages in Isaiah before and after today's text, we see the prophet proving all the ways that God's people weren't living up to God's standards. These are verses that tell of desolate countries and burned cities, like Isaiah chapter 1, verse 7. People worshiping and glorifying themselves, not God, as we see in the 8th verse of chapter 2. As I pondered the passages from Isaiah, the election season entered its final weeks. I waited for anyone running for office to offer any vision of a transformed world, but no. Over the next week, as we waited for election results to trickle in, I walked on sidewalks increasingly perilous from dead, wet leaves. I thought again about the relevance that the prophet Isaiah offers, especially in our current world where destructive forces seem so powerful, where wars erupt so regularly. Ancient prophets like Isaiah remind us over and over again that in a world that embraces war, it is those on the margins who bear the larger part of war's burden. The deaths, the dismemberments, the displacements, the resources given to the war machine and not given to projects that offer hope for a better life. Sadly, although the names of the leaders have changed, the world of the ancient prophets isn't that different from ours. We are still in a world that needs prophetic imagination. What might this look like in our current day to have a prophetic imagination? In his classic text, called The Prophetic Imagination, Walter Brueggemann tells us that the prophet shows us a world in which God can act, and that God has a plan and a purpose. Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 5, gives us a sense of God's plan and purpose if we could get ourselves into correct alignment as a society. We might protest that with people like Vladimir Putin in charge of nuclear weapons, we can't afford to embrace God's plan and purpose, that we can't align ourselves or our society to God's vision. But we have seen peaceful changes in our lifetimes, even in the face of brutal dictatorship and nuclear threats. My mind is never far from Eastern Europe, even before Putin invaded Ukraine. In this part of the world that has been so ravaged by the wars of the 20th century, we see powerful instances of prophetic imagination at work. I would remind us of Václav Havel, who lived in Czechoslovakia in a time of brutal communist suppression in the middle of the 20th century. Historian Anne Applebaum tells us that Havel and other dissidents undermined the rule of communist dictators by encouraging people to act like they were already free. And by doing this in writers' groups and artists' groups in the underground schools, These actions helped create strong institutions that were already up and running when communism fell. Havel went on to be elected the first president of free Czechoslovakia, and power was transferred peacefully, an outcome that most people wouldn't have believed could have ever happened, until it did. You might protest that you live in a free democracy. Surely Isaiah has nothing to say to you. But the dictator of capitalist culture can be just as deadly as more traditional dictators. We now face new dictators, who are really just the same old dictators. The forces of evil that take many forms, forces that have been faced in many centuries, in every century. We have our own dictators who want us to feel scared, dictators who know that they are safe as long as we cannot envision something better. I encourage us to act as if we are already living the vision described by Isaiah in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. But what can we do if we find our imagination is as dried up and withered as an autumn leaf? In this time of Advent, I encourage us to think about Jesus, who comes to tell us that the kingdom of God is inbreaking, happening right here, right now. And what does that look like? Expanding the margins of society so that all are included. And how do we do that? Sharing meals, listening to people tell their stories, looking for ways to alleviate suffering, issuing invitations to health and wholeness. Simple things, really, but actions with profound power and potential. As I have spent time walking beneath the bare trees around the seminary, I have looked up to discover all the birds' nests that I couldn't see when the trees had their leaves. I've thought about the promise of the ancient prophets that God provides a shelter for the people who are faithful. We have the promise of the ancient prophets that if we can use our power to align ourselves and our societies to right relationship with God and with each other, we can turn ourselves and our societies in a new direction, one where we no longer need to study war. In this time of Advent, as we prepare ourselves to welcome the inbreaking kingdom of God, let us develop a prophetic imagination for our own day. Let us walk in a world illumined in ways that dictators can't imagine.